A badge doesn't grant you a crown, but some men learn that the hard way. When a small-town officer decided to flex his authority on two quiet men eating pancakes, he didn't realize he was poking two highly decorated combat veterans and igniting a firestorm of instant, undeniable karma. The neon sign outside Rusty's 24-hour diner buzzed with a relentless, dying hum, casting intermittent pools of harsh red light across the rain-slicked pavement of Route 66 inches, Kingman, Arizona. It was October 14th, 2022, a few minutes past midnight. Inside, the air hung heavy with the smell of stale grease, strong black coffee, and the weary silence of travelers pushing through the graveyard shift. In the corner booth, furthest from the door, and facing the entrance, a habit neither man would ever break, sat Jeremiah Davis and Desmond Hayes. Jeremiah, a man whose broad shoulders seemed to test the structural integrity of his faded flannel shirt, was nursing a mug of black coffee. He was a former Army Special Forces medic, having spent 15 years navigating the dust of Kandahar and the dense humidity of remote operating bases. Across from him sat Desmond, a Marine Corps infantry veteran who had left part of his left leg and a significant amount of his patience in an alleyway in Fallujah. The two men, bound by the unspoken brotherhood of those who had survived the unthinkable, were driving cross-country to deliver a deceased squad mate's restored 1968 Chevrolet Chevelle to his grieving daughter in California. They were exhausted, they were quiet, and they were the only black men in the diner. Behind the counter, a sweet, grandmotherly waitress named Betty Lou Jenkins was wiping down the laminate, occasionally offering the two men a warm, knowing smile. She had recognized the bone-deep exhaustion in their eyes the moment they walked in, having seen the same look in her own son when he returned from his deployments. The quiet was shattered by the sharp jingle of the front doorbell. A sudden blast of cold, damp air rushed into the room, followed closely by Officer Bradley Mitchell. Mitchell was a local patrolman who wore his uniform a little too tight and carried his chest a little too high. He possessed the kind of manufactured swagger that usually compensated for a profound lack of real-world courage. He stomped his heavy boots on the mat, his thumbs hooked casually into his utility belt, right next to his sidearm. Mitchell ordered a coffee to go, but as he leaned against the counter waiting, his eyes began to sweep the room. They slid past the elderly couple eating pie, bypassed the exhausted trucker nodding off over his hash browns, and locked dead onto Jeremiah and Desmond. Jeremiah didn't look up from his plate of eggs, but his peripheral vision caught the sudden rigidity in the officer's posture. Under the table, Desmond subtly shifted his weight, adjusting the prosthetic leg that was aching from 10 hours of driving. "Trouble," Desmond murmured, taking a slow sip of his water. His voice barely carried over the hum of the refrigerators. "Just eat your food, Des," Jeremiah replied, his tone low and even. "We're out of here in 10. But Officer Mitchell wasn't going to let them leave in 10. With his coffee secured in one hand, he deliberately abandoned his path to the exit and sauntered over to their corner booth. He didn't just walk. He loomed. He planted his boots wide, casting a shadow over their table, and let a heavy, oppressive silence hang in the air for a full 10 seconds before speaking. "You boys lost?" Mitchell asked, the words dripping with a manufactured drawl that sounded more like a threat than a question. Jeremiah carefully set his fork down, resting his forearms on the table. He looked up, his expression completely blank, a face carved from mahogany and practiced in the art of revealing nothing. "No, officer, just getting some food before we get back on the interstate." Mitchell's eyes flicked to the window, peering through the rain at the immaculate, cherry-red 68 Chevelle hitched to the back of Jeremiah's modest, well-worn Ford F-150. "That's a mighty nice classic out there," Mitchell noted, his upper lip curling into a sneer. "A little too nice for a couple of guys passing through at midnight. Who's it belong to?" "It belongs to a friend," Desmond answered, his voice tight but controlled. "We're transporting it." "A friend?" Mitchell echoed, laughing sharply. It was a dry, hollow sound. "Right. And I'm the King of England. Let me see some identification. Betty Lou, the waitress, stepped forward from the counter, a coffee pot trembling slightly in her hand. Bradley, leave them be. They've been perfectly polite, just eating their supper. Back off, Betty, Mitchell snapped, not even looking at her. Let police handle police business. He turned his attention back to the booth, tapping his flashlight against the edge of their table. I said, IDs. Both of you? Now. Jeremiah didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he maintained unbroken eye contact with the officer. In combat zones, Jeremiah had negotiated with warlords and stared down men holding automatic weapons. A power-tripping small-town cop, barely registered on his adrenaline scale. But he knew the profound danger of a scared man with a badge. Officer, Jeremiah said, his voice dropping an octave, radiating an eerie, absolute calm. We are sitting in a public diner, consuming a meal we paid for. We haven't committed a crime. We aren't suspected of a crime. And we haven't caused a disturbance. Under what reasonable, articulable suspicion are you demanding our identification? Mitchell blinked. He clearly hadn't expected legal terminology. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a dark flush creeping up his neck. I don't need to give you a law school lecture, pal. I have a report of suspicious individuals casing vehicles in this area. You match the description. Now, hand over the IDs, or I'll pull you both out of this booth and find them myself. It was a blatant lie, and everyone in the diner knew it. The trucker in the back had stopped eating, his eyes wide. Desmond slowly reached into his jacket pocket. Mitchell's hand instantly dropped to the butt of his service weapon, unclipping the retention strap with a loud, distinct snap. Hands where I can see 'em, Mitchell barked, his voice cracking slightly as the situation he manufactured suddenly felt real. My hands are visible, officer, Desmond said, his voice dangerously quiet. He pulled out his smartphone, not a wallet. With a tap of his thumb, the screen illuminated, showing the red recording icon of a voice memo app. He set the phone gently on the table. The microphone pointed directly at Mitchell. I am recording this interaction for our safety. I am also informing you that I am an amputee. If you attempt to drag me out of this booth, you will cause me severe physical harm. Are you prepared for the liability of assaulting a disabled veteran? Mitchell stared at the glowing phone, his chest heaving. The presence of the recording device infuriated him. He felt his authority crumbling in front of the diner's audience. He leaned in close, his coffee breath washing over the table. Disabled veteran? Right, Mitchell scoffed, his eyes dropping to the olive-drab canvas duffel bag sitting on the seat next to Jeremiah, which bore a faded unit insignia. You expect me to believe you two thugs served? What's the matter? Buy that bag at an army surplus store to get a free pancake on Veterans Day. Stolen valor is a crime, you know. A terrifying silence fell over the booth. Desmond's jaw clamped shut so hard, the muscles jumped. The ghosts of the men he had lost, the very man whose car they were hauling, seemed to crowd into the cramped space. But Jeremiah moved first. Jeremiah slid out of the booth. He didn't rush. He didn't make any sudden movements. But when he stood up to his full 6'3" height, the sheer physical presence of the man forced Mitchell to take an involuntary step backward. Officer Bradley Mitchell, Jeremiah said, reading the silver name tag pinned to the cop's chest. Badge number 4092. You have detained us without probable cause, violating our Fourth Amendment rights. You have threatened physical assault on a disabled civilian, and you have just deeply insulted the memory of the men we buried. Jeremiah reached into his back pocket, using just 2 fingers, moving at a glacial pace to ensure Mitchell couldn't claim he feared for his life. He pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet and flipped it open. He didn't show a driver's license. He showed a Department of Defense identification card, right next to a silver badge that caught the harsh diner light. I am retired Master Sergeant Jeremiah Davis, United States Army, Jeremiah stated, his voice ringing through the silent diner with the cadence of a commanding officer. And this is Corporal Desmond Hayes, United States Marine Corps, Purple Heart recipient. Mitchell's eyes darted down to the DoD card. but his pride refused to let him back down. He was in too deep. "I don't care if you're the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You're being non-compliant. Turn around and put your hands on the table." Mitchell unclipped his radio from his shoulder. "Dispatch. This is Unit 4. I need backup at Rusty's Diner. 2 hostile suspects. Refusing lawful orders. Potential 10 to 3 Twopperson with a gun." "You're making a mistake, Bradley," Jeremiah warned softly, shaking his head. "A career-ending mistake. We'll see about that when you're in cuffs, Master Sergeant." Mitchell spat, drawing his handcuffs. "Turn around." Jeremiah didn't turn around. Instead, he calmly reached for his own phone on the table. "You called your backup, Officer Mitchell. Now, I'm going to call mine." Jeremiah didn't break eye contact with Officer Mitchell as his thumb tapped the screen of his phone, navigating his contacts with practiced, steady precision. The diner was dead silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the large front window and the terrified, ragged breathing of Betty Lou behind the counter. Mitchell, emboldened by his own dispatched call for backup, took a step forward, the metal handcuffs clinking in his grip. "Put the phone down, Davis. You're officially resisting a lawful order. You want to add a felony charge to your night? I will take you to the ground." "You couldn't take me to the ground if I was asleep, Mitchell," Jeremiah replied, his voice devoid of anger, which somehow made it infinitely more intimidating. It was the clinical observation of a man who knew exactly what his body was capable of. Jeremiah placed his left forearm flat on the laminate table, anchoring himself, while his right hand held the phone to his ear. Mitchell lunged. He grabbed Jeremiah's left wrist, intending to wrench it behind the veteran's back. What happened next was a masterclass in passive, immovable resistance. Jeremiah didn't strike the officer. He didn't grapple. He simply tensed the muscles in his shoulder, back, and arm, effectively turning his limb into a bolted steel beam. Mitchell, a man who relied on the compliance of terrified citizens, grunted, his boots squeaking against the linoleum as he pulled with all his body weight. Jeremiah's arm didn't move a single inch. He sat there, an immovable mountain of muscle and resolve, sipping his coffee with his free hand, while a sworn police officer strained, red-faced and panting, trying to budge him. "Let go of me, officer," Jeremiah advised gently. "You're embarrassing yourself." Across the table, Desmond hadn't flinched. His phone was still recording, capturing every humiliating second of Mitchell's futile struggle. Assaulting a disabled veteran and false imprisonment. Desmond narrated evenly for the recording. Officer is initiating unwarranted physical contact without establishing probable cause. "Shut up!" Mitchell roared, finally releasing Jeremiah's arm and stepping back, chest heaving, his hand instinctively dropping back to his holstered firearm. He was cornered by his own incompetence, his pride wounded in front of an audience. He unclasped the holster again. "Both of you, on the ground, now, or I will draw my weapon." Just as Mitchell's fingers curled around the grip of his pistol, a voice boomed from Jeremiah's phone. "Davis, it's past midnight. This better be life or death, or I'm making you run laps until your knees give out." The voice on the other end was gruff, thick with sleep, but carried an unmistakable cadence of authority. Jeremiah pulled the phone from his ear and tapped the speaker button, placing it precisely in the center of the table. "Sorry to wake you, Captain," Jeremiah said, his tone instantly shifting from defensive civilian to respectful subordinate. "We've run into a bit of a snag passing through your jurisdiction, currently sitting at Rusty's Diner on Route 66. "My jurisdiction?" The man on the phone cleared his throat. "What kind of snag, Jeremiah? You and Desmond okay?" "We're fine," Jeremiah replied. "But one of your patrolmen, A. Bradley Mitchell, badge 4092, has decided we fit the profile of a couple of car thieves. He's currently threatening to draw his service weapon on us after attempting an unlawful detainment." Mitchell froze. The color rapidly drained from his face. He recognized that gruff voice. Every officer in the Kingman precinct knew that voice. Before Mitchell could process the impending disaster, the wail of sirens pierced the rainy night. Red and blue lights exploded through the diner windows, casting frantic, strobing shadows across the walls. Tires screeched on the wet asphalt outside. Mitchell's backup had arrived. The front door burst open. 2 officers, weapons drawn and flashlights blindingly bright, rushed into the diner. Officer Kyle Higgins, a squared-away cop with 5 years on the force, swept the room with his muzzle. "Mitchell, status!" Higgins yelled, his eyes darting from the elderly couple hiding under their table to the 2 black men sitting perfectly still in the corner booth. "They're hostile, Higgins," Mitchell shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of panic and desperate vindication. "Suspects are non-compliant. Hands where I can see them." Higgins advanced, his weapon trained on Jeremiah's chest. "Keep your hands on the table. Don't move." Jeremiah didn't flinch at the sight of the drawn guns. He had stared down the barrels of AK-47s in the Korengal Valley. A Glock 19, held by a nervous patrolman, was a different kind of threat, but one he knew how to manage. He kept his hands flat, palms down, next to his coffee mug and the speakerphone. Desmond shifted his weight slightly. "Officers, my hands are visible. I am an amputee. My phone is recording. We are unarmed." "Higgins," the voice from the speakerphone suddenly cracked through the tense, screaming chaos of the diner. It was sharp as a whip. "Officer Kyle Higgins, is that you?" Higgins froze, his finger hovering outside the trigger guard. He blinked, confused, lowering his flashlight slightly to look at the phone on the table. Who is this?" "This is Chief Benjamin Carter," the phone barked, the sleep entirely gone from his voice, replaced by cold, furious command. "Lower your weapon immediately, Higgins. That is a direct order. If you or Mitchell so much as scratch either of those men, I will personally see to it that you spend the rest of your lives in federal prison." The silence that followed Chief Carter's command was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the tinny sound of the chief's breathing through the phone speaker and the relentless hum of the diner's neon sign. Officer Higgins immediately lowered his weapon, his training kicking in. He recognized the chief's voice without a shadow of a doubt. He holstered his firearm and stepped back, turning a bewildered and furious glare toward Mitchell. The second backup officer mirrored Higgins, stepping down his stance and securing his weapon. "Chief?" Higgins asked, stepping closer to the table, looking at the glowing phone screen. "Chief Carter, is that really you?" Mitchell called in a 10-32, said we had armed, hostile suspects. "Mitchell is a liar," Chief Carter's voice spat from the phone, laced with an anger that made Higgins flinch. "You are looking at Master Sergeant Jeremiah Davis and Corporal Desmond Hayes. They served under my command in the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Davis pulled me out of a burning Humvee in Helmand Province while taking enemy fire. They are not car thieves, and they are certainly not hostile, unless provoked by an idiot." Mitchell stood paralyzed, his hand still resting on his unclipped holster. His mind was racing, desperately searching for a way out of the colossal hole he had dug for himself. The swagger was gone, replaced by the terrifying realization that he had just picked a fight with the chief of police's personal savior. "Chief, listen," Mitchell stammered, stepping toward the table, his voice pleading. They matched a description. They were acting suspicious. I was just doing my job, doing community policing. "Shut your mouth, Mitchell," Carter interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "I know exactly what you were doing. I've read your file. I've seen the complaints about your community policing tactics on the night shift. You saw 2 black men in a diner. You saw a classic car outside. And your pathetic prejudices did the rest of the math." Desmond leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Mitchell. "He also accused us of stolen valor, Chief. Said we bought our gear at a surplus store to get free pancakes." A heavy sigh echoed through the speaker. "Higgins," Carter commanded. "Yes, Chief," Higgins responded, standing at attention. "Disarm Officer Mitchell. Take his badge, his weapon, and his radio. He is suspended, effective immediately, pending a full internal affairs investigation and a referral to the district attorney for civil rights violations. Mitchell stumbled back as if he had been physically struck. "Chief, you can't do this. You're taking the word of these guys over a sworn officer? Over a traffic stop?" "It wasn't a traffic stop, Bradley. You harassed civilians eating dinner," Carter fired back. "Higgins, execute the order." Now, Higgins didn't hesitate. He had never liked Mitchell, finding the older cop's methods sloppy and aggressive. Higgins stepped up to Mitchell, extending his hand. "Give it up, Brad. Hand over the belt." "This is absurd," Mitchell muttered, his hands trembling as he unbuckled his utility belt. The heavy clatter of his gun, taser, and handcuffs hitting a nearby empty table sounded like the death knell of his career. He unpinned his silver badge, the shield he had used as a bludgeon just 10 minutes prior, and dropped it onto the pile. "I am 5 minutes away," Chief Carter announced through the phone. "Nobody leaves that diner. Higgins, get Betty Lou a glass of water. She sounds like she's about to faint." True to his word, less than 5 minutes later, a black, unmarked SUV tore into the parking lot, tires throwing a massive spray of rainwater across the asphalt. The diner doors swung open, and Chief Benjamin Carter walked in. He wasn't in uniform. He wore a pair of faded jeans, a heavy winter coat thrown hastily over a t-shirt, and a pair of boots that weren't fully laced. But the aura of absolute authority he projected filled the room instantly. Carter was a formidable man, his hair silvering at the temples, a deep scar tracing the jawline on the left side of his face, a souvenir from the same ambush where Jeremiah had saved his life. He bypassed his officers entirely, his eyes fixed on the corner booth. When Carter reached the table, Jeremiah stood up. The two men didn't salute. They didn't shake hands. They pulled each other into a brief, fiercely tight embrace, the kind reserved only for men who have bled into the same dirt. "Good to see you, Captain," Jeremiah said softly, stepping back. "You too, Davis. You too," Carter said, his eyes a little brighter than they had been when he walked in. He looked down at Desmond, who was leaning heavily on his cane, having stood up as well. "Desmond, it's been too long, though I wish the circumstances were better." "We're all right, sir," Desmond replied, a tight smile forming. "Just trying to get Brian's car to Lily out in San Diego. Didn't expect a welcoming committee." Carter's expression softened at the mention of their fallen comrade. Brian was a good man, taking his Chevelle to his daughter. "That's a noble mission, boys." Carter's demeanor abruptly shifted as he turned around. The warmth vanished, replaced by the terrifying, cold gaze of a commanding officer observing a disgraced subordinate. He slowly walked over to where Mitchell was standing, stripped of his gear, looking small and intensely vulnerable in his ill-fitting uniform. "Look at me, Mitchell," Carter ordered. Mitchell slowly raised his eyes, unable to meet the chief's gaze for more than a second. "You are a disgrace to that uniform," Carter said, his voice low enough that only the officers and the veterans could hear it, but vibrating with a terrifying intensity. "You use your badge to bully people you think don't have a voice. You picked the wrong men tonight, Mitchell. But what terrifies me is how many times you've done this to people who didn't have my phone number on speed dial." Mitchell opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic defense, but Carter held up a hand. "Save it for the investigators. Higgins, put him in the back of your cruiser. He can sit in the cage while I take his statement. Then he can walk home." As Higgins escorted a thoroughly humiliated Mitchell out into the freezing rain, the diner seemed to collectively exhale. The trucker in the back finally took a bite of his cold hash browns. Betty Lou wiped a tear from her eye and hurried to pour fresh, steaming coffee into Jeremiah and Desmond's mugs. Chief Carter slid into the booth next to Jeremiah, gesturing for Desmond to sit back down and rest his leg. He looked at the two veterans, shaking his head with a mixture of exhaustion and profound respect. "I owe you boys an apology on behalf of this department," Carter said sincerely. "You didn't deserve that." Jeremiah took a sip of the fresh coffee, the tension finally leaving his massive shoulders. "We didn't need an apology, Ben. We just needed a referee. Karma just happened to be wearing your pajamas tonight." The tension in Rusty's 2-4, our diner, slowly dissipated, replaced by the comforting, mundane sounds of clinking silverware, and the low rumble of the highway outside. Chief Benjamin Carter sat heavily in the vinyl booth, opposite Jeremiah and Desmond, his hands wrapped around a thick ceramic mug of black coffee. The deep lines on his face, usually hardened by years of commanding a police force in a town that straddled a major interstate drug corridor, were softened by a profound sense of relief and a simmering, righteous anger. "I need you boys to understand something," Carter began, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper so as not to carry across the diner. "What happened tonight wasn't just a random act of prejudice by a bad apple. It was the final nail in a coffin I've been trying to build for 6 months." Jeremiah raised an eyebrow, leaning back against the vinyl seat. "You were already building a case against him?" "A federal one," Carter nodded, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He glanced toward the front window, where the flashing lights of the police cruisers were finally fading into the rainy night as Higgins drove Mitchell away. Bradley Mitchell wasn't just a bully. He was a thief, operating under the color of law. We've had a quiet, joint task force looking into him with the State Bureau of Investigation. Mitchell had a very specific, very dirty modus operandi. Desmond leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Civil asset forfeiture." Carter pointed a finger at Desmond. "Exactly. He worked the graveyard shift by choice. He profiled out-of-state plates, specifically targeting minorities or folks who looked like they didn't have the money for a high-powered defense attorney. He'd manufacture probable cause, a phantom swerve over the yellow line, a busted taillight that suddenly wasn't busted anymore, and he'd initiate a search. If he found cash, jewelry, or high-value assets, he'd seize them, claiming he suspected they were tied to narcotics trafficking. And the Chevelle out front? Jeremiah realized, his eyes narrowing as he looked through the rain-streaked window at the pristine classic car sitting on their trailer. The Chevelle was his golden goose tonight, Carter confirmed grimly. He saw 2 black men hauling a perfectly restored, classic muscle car worth at least 80 grand in the dead of night. He didn't just want to harass you. He wanted to provoke a reaction, arrest you both for resisting or assaulting an officer, impound your truck, and seize that Chevelle under the pretense that it was stolen or being transported for a cartel buyer. Once it was in the impound lot, his buddies in the corrupt towing company would ensure it got lost in the paperwork until it went to a closed police auction, where an associate would buy it for pennies on the dollar. A cold silence fell over the booth. The sheer audacity and malice of the scheme hung in the air. He's been getting away with it because his victims were terrified, out of their jurisdiction, and couldn't afford to fight the labyrinth of civil forfeiture laws, Carter continued, his jaw tightening. But I couldn't move on him. I didn't have ironclad proof. He was smart about turning off his body camera, or claiming it malfunctioned during the crucial moments of his stops. Carter reached across the table and tapped the surface of Desmond's smartphone, which was now sitting dark and quiet next to the salt shaker. "Until tonight," the chief said, a grim smile finally touching his lips. "Desmond, your audio recording captured him, explicitly threatening physical violence against a disabled veteran without establishing a single shred of probable cause or identifying a crime. It captured him refusing to accept valid federal identification. It establishes a crystal-clear timeline of an unconstitutional detainment. You didn't just defend yourselves tonight. You handed me the silver bullet. By tomorrow morning, the FBI field office in Phoenix will have this tape, and Mitchell will be facing federal deprivation of rights charges." "Glad we could assist the local constabulary, Ben," Jeremiah said, a low rumble of amusement in his chest. "Though I'd prefer a quieter reunion next time." "Next time, you call me when you hit the county line, and I'll buy the steaks," Carter said, sliding out of the booth. He stood up, towering over the table, and extended his hand. Jeremiah took it, a firm, familiar grip between 2 men who had survived hell together. He shook Desmond's hand next, squeezing his shoulder gently. "Drive safe, boys. Deliver that car. Brian deserves that piece." As Carter turned to leave, Betty Lou emerged from behind the counter, carrying a massive brown paper bag, practically bursting at the seams. She marched right past the chief and set it down in front of Jeremiah. "I packed you boys 4 extra sandwiches, a whole cherry pie, and 2 thermoses of fresh coffee," the older woman said, her voice shaking slightly, but her eyes fierce. "You don't pay a dime for anything tonight. And if that badge-wearing thug ever bothers you again, you tell him Betty Lou will take a frying pan to his thick skull." From the back of the diner, the exhausted trucker stood up. He was a mountain of a man, wearing a faded denim jacket over a flannel shirt. He walked over, pulling a worn leather wallet from his pocket, and slapped a crisp $50 bill on the counter next to Betty Lou's register. "I got their tab, Betty," the trucker said, turning to Jeremiah and Desmond. He offered a sharp, crisp nod that spoke volumes. "1st Battalion, 5th Marines, Hue City, 68. You boys handled yourselves like professionals tonight. Have a safe drive to the coast." "Thank you, brother," Desmond said softly, recognizing the deep bond of the Corps in the older man's eyes. "Semper Fi." "Hoorah," the trucker grunted, turning back to his cold hash browns. 15 minutes later, Jeremiah's F-150 rumbled back to life. The heavy rain had finally broken, leaving behind a slick, shimmering highway that reflected the dim moonlight. As they pulled out of Rusty's 2-4-hour diner, a single Kingman police cruiser pulled out behind them. It wasn't tailgating. It hung back at a respectful distance, its headlights cutting through the desert darkness. Chief Carter escorted them all the way to the county line, a silent vanguard ensuring their safe passage out of his territory. When they finally crossed the border, the cruiser flashed its headlights twice a salute before pulling a slow U-turn and disappearing back into the night. The drive through the Mojave Desert was quiet, save for the hum of the tires and the classic rock playing softly on the radio. As dawn broke, painting the harsh desert landscape in brilliant shades of burnt orange and deep violet, the reality of what had happened finally settled over them. The karma that struck Bradley Mitchell was absolute, swift, and merciless. In the weeks that followed, the story didn't just stay in Kingman. The State Bureau of Investigation moved in with devastating speed. The audio recording Desmond captured was the linchpin that shattered Mitchell's defense. Stripped of his badge, his gun, and the unearned power he used to terrorize innocent people, Mitchell found himself entirely isolated. The local police union, seeing the overwhelming federal evidence and the explosive nature of the civil rights charges involving decorated combat veterans, publicly refused to back him. His wife, unable to bear the public disgrace and the sudden freezing of their assets, pending the corruption investigation, filed for divorce. 6 months later, Bradley Mitchell stood in a federal courtroom, crying as a judge handed down a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. A terrifying prospect for a disgraced former cop. He lost his pension, his freedom, and his name. The karma was a flawless, devastating strike against a man who believed his badge was a shield for his own malice. But on that morning, driving out of the desert and into the golden, rolling hills of Southern California, Jeremiah and Desmond weren't thinking about Bradley Mitchell. They were thinking about a man named Brian, who had taken a piece of shrapnel meant for Jeremiah in a dusty valley thousands of miles away. By mid-afternoon, the salty air of the Pacific Ocean filled the cabin of the truck. They pulled into a quiet, sun-drenched suburban neighborhood in San Diego, the trailer tires crunching softly against the pavement. They parked in front of a small, neatly kept house with a tire swing in the front yard. Sitting on the porch steps was a young woman in her late 20s. Amanda had her father's sharp eyes and his stubborn chin. When she saw the truck and the gleaming, cherry-red 1968 Chevelle sitting behind it, she stood up, her hands flying to her mouth. Jeremiah threw the truck into park and killed the engine. He and Desmond stepped out into the warm California sun. They walked to the back of the trailer, unhooking the heavy chains and lowering the ramps in practiced, reverent silence. Jeremiah climbed into the driver's seat of the Chevelle. He turned the key, and the massive V8 engine roared to life, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to shake the very pavement. He slowly backed the classic car off the trailer, parking it perfectly in Amanda's driveway. When he killed the engine, the silence that followed was heavy and profound. Jeremiah stepped out of the car, holding a single silver key on a braided leather keychain. He walked up the driveway, Desmond limping quietly beside him. Amanda was openly weeping now, tears streaming down her face as she ran her hand over the pristine, polished hood of the car her father had spent his life dreaming of finishing. "He wanted you to have it for your 30th birthday, Amanda," Jeremiah said softly, his own voice thick with emotion. He reached out, gently placing the silver key into the palm of her hand, closing her fingers over it. "He talked about it every single night. He wanted you to drive it down the coast, with the windows down." Amanda looked from the car to the two massive, scarred men standing in her driveway. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She stepped forward and threw her arms around Jeremiah's neck, burying her face in his shoulder, sobbing. Jeremiah closed his eyes, wrapping his heavy arms around her, feeling the ghost of his fallen brother standing right beside them in the driveway. Desmond rested a hand on her back, his eyes trained on the bright blue California sky. They had driven through the rain, faced down the ugly face of corrupt authority, and carried the weight of a shattered promise across the country. But in the end, standing in the warm sun with the roar of the ocean in the distance, the darkness of the previous night felt like 1,000,000 miles away. They had completed the mission. True authority is not just found in a piece of metal pinned to a chest, but in the quiet dignity of one's actions. Bradley Mitchell sought to humiliate two heroes, only to completely dismantle his own life. Meanwhile, Jeremiah and Desmond completed their mission, proving that honor, unlike a badge, can never be stripped away. Karma doesn't just knock. Sometimes, it kicks the door down and demands its absolute due.